Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and distinguished senators. We're holding this hearing on juvenile gun violence today for one simple reason. The kids are not all right. But the reasons why they're not all right are far more complex than our current national dialogue often admits. Despite some horrific high-profile mass school shootings in recent years, these are just a fraction of a percent of the problem. And I know, how can I possibly sit here next to a witness who lost a child at Parkland and when we're still burying kids after Uvalde and say that? I don't expect that statistical probabilities make any parent feel the least bit better when mourning the loss of a child. The rarity doesn't lessen their pain or make it any less traumatic, and these shootings devastate communities. But numbers matter when shaping public policy to keep the nation's kids safe. An average of 10 students are killed by gunfire on school property during school hours every year. That's 10 too many. That number should be 0. We can and should make our schools safer. But schools are not where most of our kids are dying. The vast majority of juvenile gun deaths are out-of-school suicides and homicides, neither of which receives nearly as much attention. And suggesting that the problem is simply guns does everyone a disservice. The problem is deeper. Our kids are suffering from a decades-long downward spiral of mental and emotional unwellness, and it's leading them to take their lives at increasing rates, especially since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Well over 1,000 high school-aged teens killed themselves with firearms last year. Over 1,000 more killed themselves without a firearm. Our kids are also increasingly uninterested in going to school, with chronic absenteeism rates in major districts this year reaching as high as 40%. This, unsurprisingly, correlates with kids increasingly engaging in serious criminal behaviors that make it more likely they'll victimize others or become victims of gun violence themselves. You can find far more examples in the last school year of teenagers being shot specifically by armed victims while engaging in criminal activity than of teenagers being shot in schools. So what's the federal role in all of this? Because that's the question. That's why we're all here today, right? Well, we know it doesn't work. Banning certain semi-automatic firearms or standard capacity magazines are not serious solutions, and they're based more on irrational fear than on data or on the Constitution. They become even less serious in the context of juvenile deaths, where most of these kids are already unable to lawfully purchase any firearms and are overwhelmingly using or being victimized by criminals with illegally possessed handguns. So instead of wasting too much time on what won't save our kids, I'm going to highlight 3 solutions out of the many proposed in my written submission, which I hope you read. So number 1, allow schools to shift unused COVID funds to school security and mental health. Physical security matters. Swift, armed responses to threats, whether mass shootings or any other threat, matter. Student access to mental health resources matters. Schools have access right now to over $100 billion in already allocated COVID relief funds. They can and should be able to use it in the short term to hire mental health professionals and invest in physical security needs as a short-term solution, giving them flexibility over the next few years to cut administrative bloat and prioritize long-term spending where it will be most effective. Number 2, authorize true behavioral threat assessment research and training. Most state and local agencies lack any coherent system for analyzing threats in their own communities. Meanwhile, many federal agencies have decades of training and experience with behavioral threat assessment. Congress can facilitate this process of taking these strategies that we know work at a federal level to prevent targeted mass violence and retooling them in a way that makes sense for state and local entities. Number 3, provide healthier, more stable environments for our kids. The root of the problem is not guns. It's the underlying causes that create violent environments in the first place. Parents, and especially low-income and working parents, need more choices when it comes to accessing mental health care for their kids. They also need more choices when it comes to adequate learning environments. Studies and statistics clearly show that when parents can more easily remove their kids from schools where they are bullied, face violent threats, or are not otherwise receiving necessary resources, it alleviates the risk of suicide and the likelihood that they will participate in criminal behaviors that are most associated with violent outcomes, like gun-related death and injury. Kids deserve educational environments where they feel safe and are most likely to develop into thriving adults, regardless of income or zip code. Senators, it's clear that the kids are not all right. They're increasingly suicidal. They're increasingly engaging in serious criminal behaviors. They're increasingly deciding that school just isn't worth it, and we are watching as their futures and their lives vanish. We are losing our kids. And if we don't act soon and act to stem these problems at the source, it won't just be the kids that we're losing. We will lose an entire generation of adults as well. And I look forward to your questions.